The early morning sun had barely risen when Staff Sergeant Marcus Wilson's phone rang. It was 5:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, and Marcus was already up, preparing for his regular duties at Fort Bragg Military Base. He picked up the phone, instantly recognizing the number from the Military Mortuary Affairs Office. "Staff Sergeant Wilson, we have an assignment for you," said the voice on the other end. "A soldier has fallen in Afghanistan. Private First Class James Hendricks. His remains are being flown back tomorrow. We need you to escort him home to his family in Minneapolis." Marcus stood straighter, even though no one could see him. "Yes, sir. I understand the responsibility. I'll be ready." This wasn't Marcus's first time serving as an honor guard escort, but each assignment carried the same weight. At 34 years old, with 12 years of military service behind him, Marcus knew exactly what this duty meant. It was one of the hardest tasks a soldier could be asked to perform, but also one of the most important. After ending the call, Marcus sat on the edge of his bed and took a deep breath. He looked at the framed photo of his own family on the nightstand, his wife Keisha and their two children, Zoe and Jamal. He thought about Private Hendricks's family, waiting for their son to come home for the last time. "I'll make sure he gets there with honor," Marcus whispered to himself. The rest of the day was filled with preparations. Marcus went to the base office to receive his official orders and the detailed protocol documents. The military had strict procedures for escorting fallen soldiers. Every step was laid out clearly: how to dress, how to behave, the exact words to say when presenting the remains to the family. Marcus called the airline to confirm the special arrangements. The woman on the phone assured him everything was set. "We have the information about the fallen soldier transport. We'll have everything ready for you tomorrow," she said professionally. That evening, Marcus carefully prepared his dress uniform. He polished the brass buttons until they shone like gold. He made sure every medal was perfectly placed. He shined his shoes until he could see his reflection in them. His white gloves were spotless. While ironing his uniform, his wife Keisha came into the room. "Another escort duty?" she asked softly, seeing the solemn look on her husband's face. Marcus nodded. "Private First Class. Only 22 years old." Keisha placed her hand on his shoulder. "You'll do right by him and his family." "That's all I can do," Marcus replied. "Make sure he gets home with the respect he deserves." Later that night, Marcus reviewed the file on PFC Hendricks. He studied the young man's service photo. A fresh-faced kid with a proud smile. Hendricks had been serving his first tour when an IED took his life. He had a mother, father, and a younger sister waiting for him back home. Marcus couldn't sleep much that night. He kept thinking about the responsibility ahead. Escorting a fallen soldier was a sacred duty. He would be the final representative of the military to care for this young man. How he conducted himself would be part of what the family remembered forever. When his alarm went off at 4:00 a.m., Marcus was already awake. He dressed carefully in his uniform, checking every detail in the mirror. As he prepared to leave, he kissed his sleeping children on their foreheads and hugged his wife goodbye. "I'll call you when I arrive in Minneapolis," he told Keisha. "Be strong," she said. "That family needs your strength now." Marcus nodded, picked up his bag, and walked out into the dark morning. His mission had begun. Marcus arrived at the military airbase just as the sun was coming up. The morning air was cool and crisp. Other soldiers moved around the tarmac, but they seemed to step more quietly near the hangar where PFC Hendricks's flag-draped transfer case waited. A small ceremony took place before the transfer. 6 soldiers carefully moved the case from the military transport to the hearse that would take them to the commercial airport. Marcus stood at attention, his salute perfect and unwavering. Though he had done this before, the weight of the moment never lessened. "Travel well, soldier," the chaplain said as they closed the doors of the hearse. During the drive to the airport, Marcus reviewed his paperwork once more. Everything needed to be perfect. The airline had been notified. The TSA had special protocols for fallen soldiers. He had memorized the flight numbers, gate information, and transfer procedures. "First time as an escort?" asked the driver, an older veteran who volunteered for these duties. "No, sir. My fourth," Marcus replied, "but it never gets easier." "It shouldn't," the driver nodded. "That's how you know you're doing it right." At the airport's special services entrance, a representative was supposed to meet them. Marcus checked his watch, 7:45 a.m., Their flight was at 9:30 a.m. The representative was 10 minutes late, and Marcus felt the first twinge of concern. Finally, a harried-looking woman appeared. "Staff Sergeant Wilson, I'm Tracy from customer service. I'm so sorry for the delay. Follow me, please." Marcus supervised as airport staff and military personnel transferred PFC Hendrix's case from the hearse. He made sure they handled everything with proper respect. The case was placed on a special cart draped with an American flag. "The plane will board in about an hour," Tracy explained. "We'll do a special boarding for you first, and then we'll load the transfer case with full honors." Marcus nodded. "Thank you. I need to stay with him at all times." Tracy looked uncertain for a moment. "Even during loading? That's not usually." "It's military protocol," Marcus interrupted firmly but politely. "I maintain visual contact with the fallen at all times until delivery to the family." "Of course," Tracy said quickly. "We'll make it happen." In the terminal, people noticed Marcus in his dress uniform walking alongside the flag-draped case. Many stood respectfully. Some placed their hands over their hearts. An older man who wore a Vietnam veteran cap stood and saluted as they passed. Marcus acknowledged the respect with a nod, but kept his focus on his duty. The airport staff had cleared a special waiting area near the gate where he could stay with PFC Hendrix's remains. As he sat in the quiet corner, Marcus took out PFC Hendrix's file again. He studied the young man's face, wanting to know the soldier he was escorting home. James Jimmy Hendrix had played baseball in high school. He had joined the Army 2 years ago, hoping to eventually use the GI Bill to become a teacher. Now, Marcus would meet Jimmy's parents and sister. He would be the one to say the formal words of condolence from a grateful nation. He would be the face of the military that had sent their son into harm's way. A gate agent approached. "Staff Sergeant, we're preparing to board. Would you like some water or coffee before we begin the boarding process?" "No, thank you. I'm ready when you are," Marcus replied, standing and straightening his uniform. The agent nodded. "We'll begin boarding in 15 minutes. The ground crew is preparing for the special loading procedure." Marcus checked his watch again. Everything was running smoothly so far. In a few hours, they would be in Minneapolis. The most difficult part of his duty would come then, facing a family whose world had shattered. But until that moment, his job was to ensure PFC Hendrix's journey home was handled with perfect dignity and respect. What Marcus didn't know was that trouble was brewing at the gate desk, where a new supervisor had just started his shift and was questioning the special arrangements. The gate area had started to fill with passengers when a man in a crisp airline supervisor uniform approached Marcus. His name tag read Richard Keller, supervisor. He had a clipboard in his hand and a frown on his face. "Excuse me," Richard said, looking at Marcus with narrowed eyes. "There seems to be some confusion about this. Special transport." Marcus stood up straight. "There shouldn't be any confusion, sir. All the arrangements were confirmed yesterday. I'm escorting the remains of Private First Class Hendrix back to his family." Richard looked down at his clipboard, then back at Marcus. "Yes. Well, I don't see the proper authorization forms here, and I don't recall being informed about any military transport today." Marcus took a deep breath. He had been through this process before, but never faced this kind of questioning. He reached into his folder and pulled out his military orders. "Here are my official orders, sir, and here's the confirmation email from your airline." Everything was arranged through proper channels. Richard barely glanced at the papers. "Anyone could print these out. I need to see official military identification and additional verification." By now, several nearby passengers had noticed the conversation. An older woman looked concerned. A businessman stopped typing on his laptop to watch. "Sir, I am in full military dress uniform," Marcus said calmly, though he could feel his heart beating faster. "I provided all required documentation. That flag-draped case contains a fallen American soldier who deserves to be treated with respect." Richard's voice got louder. "I'm just following protocol. We can't just let anyone claim to be military escort without proper verification." A flight attendant named Sarah, who had been preparing the cabin, walked over. "Is there a problem, Richard? We were informed about the military escort yesterday." "I wasn't informed," Richard insisted. "And I need to see more authorization than this gentleman has provided." The way he said gentleman made several people look up. Marcus remained professional, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Sir," Marcus said firmly, "I am Staff Sergeant Marcus Wilson of the United States Army. I have been assigned to escort PFC Hendricks home to his family. Every minute we delay is disrespectful to his sacrifice." An older man wearing a Vietnam veteran's hat who had been sitting nearby stood up and approached. "What seems to be the problem here? This soldier is on official duty." Richard turned to the man. "This doesn't concern you, sir. Please return to your seat." "The hell it doesn't," the veteran said. "That's one of our fallen being escorted home. Show some respect." More passengers were now watching. Someone had taken out their phone and started recording. Marcus noticed this but kept his focus on resolving the situation professionally. "Mr. Keller," Marcus said, using the supervisor's name from his badge, "perhaps we could speak with the station manager. I'd be happy to provide any additional verification they might need. We cannot delay this flight." Richard crossed his arms. "The station manager is busy. Until I get proper verification, that case is not getting on this plane." A young woman who had been listening stood up. "Are you seriously preventing a fallen soldier from being taken home? And questioning this soldier's authority because he's black? Is that what's happening here?" Richard's face reddened. "This has nothing to do with, that's not what. I'm simply following procedures." The terminal had grown quiet except for the sound of boarding announcements for other flights. More phones were out now, recording the scene. Marcus remained calm, though the disrespect to PSC Hendricks made his blood boil. "Mr. Keller, I understand you have a job to do, but I also have a sacred duty. Please call your station manager now, or I will be forced to escalate this situation. This young soldier did not give his life so he could be disrespected in an airport." The tension in the air was thick. Several passengers had moved closer, forming an impromptu wall of support behind Marcus. The situation was quickly spiraling beyond Richard's control, and in the back of the crowd, someone in a higher-ranking airline uniform was pushing their way forward. "What's going on here?" A woman in an airline management uniform pushed through the growing crowd. Her name tag identified her as Diane Matthews, regional manager. Richard turned, looking partly relieved and partly nervous. "Ma'am, I was just trying to verify this escort situation. The paperwork seems irregular." Diane looked at the gathering crowd, the phones recording, and Marcus standing tall in his dress uniform. She quickly assessed the situation. "Staff Sergeant, I apologize for any confusion. May I see your orders?" she asked Marcus directly, her tone respectful. Marcus handed over his documentation without comment. His face remained professional, but those closest could see the tension in his jaw. Diane reviewed the papers carefully, nodding as she read. "Everything appears to be in order, Staff Sergeant Wilson. These are standard military escort orders." She turned to Richard. "These are legitimate military orders, Richard. The airline was notified about this transport yesterday." Richard's face flushed. "But the system didn't flag it for me. I was just following." "Not now," Diane cut him off with a sharp whisper. Then louder for everyone to hear, "Staff Sergeant Wilson, we will begin boarding immediately. You and Private First Class Hendricks will board first, as is proper protocol." A small cheer went up from the gathered passengers. The Vietnam veteran nodded in approval. Marcus spoke clearly. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your help in ensuring PFC Hendricks receives the respect he deserves." Diane turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be boarding shortly. As is our airline's policy, we will first board our military escort and the fallen service member he is accompanying. We ask that you remain standing and silent during this process, as a sign of respect." As Richard tried to slip away, Diane caught his arm. "Stay right here. This is a teaching moment for you." The gate agent made an announcement. "We will now begin our special boarding process for our fallen soldier. Please stand in silence as a show of respect." Marcus stood at attention as the ground crew appeared with PFC Hendricks's flag-draped transfer case. The entire gate area fell silent. People stood, many with hands over their hearts. Veterans present offered solemn salutes. A path cleared through the crowd. Marcus walked alongside the case as it was wheeled toward the jet bridge. His steps were measured, precise. His white gloves stood out against the dark blue of his uniform. An older woman wiped tears from her eyes. A young boy asked his mother in a whisper what was happening, and she explained quietly about sacrifice and honor. As Marcus reached the jet bridge entrance, he turned and saluted the gathered crowd. Many returned the gesture in their own ways, nods, hands over hearts, or salutes from those who had served. Diane stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant, we've arranged for you to remain with Private Hendricks during the loading process, as is proper. The captain would also like to say a few words once everyone is aboard." "Thank you," Marcus said. "That would mean a lot." As they proceeded down the jet bridge, Diane spoke quietly to Marcus. "I want to personally apologize for what happened. That's not who we are as an airline." "Ma'am, what matters is that PFC Hendricks gets home with dignity," Marcus replied. "That's my only concern right now." On the tarmac, the ground crew stood at attention as the transfer case was carefully loaded. Marcus maintained his watchful presence, ensuring every movement was handled with care and respect. Back in the terminal, Richard was being escorted to an office by another manager. Several passengers approached Diane with comments about the incident, many mentioning they had recorded the whole thing. A businessman in an expensive suit shook his head. "I fly this airline every week. What I just witnessed was disgraceful. That young man handled himself with incredible professionalism while your supervisor." "I understand, sir," Diane said, "and I assure you this will be addressed immediately." As the regular boarding process began, the mood was solemn and reflective. In the first row of the plane, Marcus sat straight and tall, his duty far from over. The aircraft door closed with a heavy thud. Marcus sat in the first row seat that had been reserved for him. From his position, he could see the cargo hold where PFC Hendricks's transfer case had been carefully secured. The flight attendants moved through their pre-flight routines, but their usual cheerful demeanor was subdued. The captain's voice came over the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Robert Hayes speaking. Before we depart today, I want to acknowledge that we have the honor of carrying one of America's fallen heroes on our flight. Private First Class James Hendricks is returning home to his family, escorted by Staff Sergeant Marcus Wilson. I ask that we all take a moment of silence to honor Private Hendricks's sacrifice." The plane fell completely quiet. Even the small children seemed to sense the importance of the moment. After 30 seconds, the captain continued. "Thank you. We'll be departing shortly for Minneapolis. Our flight time will be approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. We have clear skies ahead, and I promise you we will deliver Private Hendricks home with the dignity and respect he deserves." A flight attendant named Jenny approached Marcus. "Staff Sergeant, is there anything you need before takeoff?" "No, thank you," Marcus replied. "I appreciate everyone's professionalism." As the plane pushed back from the gate, Marcus's phone vibrated. It was a text message from Keisha. "How's it going? Everything okay?" Marcus typed quickly. "Had some trouble at the gate. Someone questioned my authority to escort. Situation resolved. Taking off now." He turned off his phone as instructed for takeoff, but not before seeing Keisha's reply. "Stay strong. So proud of you." Once they reached cruising altitude, Marcus noticed passengers occasionally glancing his way. Some nodded respectfully. Others simply watched him, perhaps wondering about his story, about the fallen soldier he was escorting. An hour into the flight, Diane, the regional manager who had intervened at the gate, came from the back of the plane and knelt beside Marcus's seat. "Staff Sergeant, I wanted to update you. My team has been in contact with our Minneapolis station. They're arranging an honor guard to meet the plane when we land. The airport police will provide an escort to help you reach the funeral home without delay." "Thank you, ma'am. That's very thoughtful," Marcus said. Diane lowered her voice. "I also want you to know that what happened at the gate. Richard has been suspended pending review. The airline CEO has been informed of the incident." Marcus nodded but said nothing. His focus remained on his duty, not on seeking punishment for the supervisor. "There's something else," Diane continued. "Several passengers uploaded videos of the incident. It's already getting attention online. Our PR team is preparing a statement." Marcus sighed quietly. "I'm not interested in making this a big story, ma'am. I just want to complete my mission with dignity." "I understand," Diane replied, "but I thought you should know." As Diane returned to her seat, Marcus looked out the window at the clouds below. He thought about PFC Hendricks's family waiting in Minneapolis, preparing to face the most difficult day of their lives. His own discomfort at the gate seemed small by comparison. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned over. "Excuse me, Sergeant. I just wanted to say thank you, not just for your service, but for how you handled yourself back there. My son is in the army too, deployed in South Korea right now." "Thank you, sir. I hope he comes home safe," Marcus replied. "Me too," the man said, his voice catching slightly. "What you're doing today, it matters. To all of us." Other passengers were listening. A woman two rows back added, "We're all witnesses now. To both the disrespect and the dignity. We won't forget either." Marcus felt the weight of their expectations, their gratitude, their witness. He was no longer just escorting PFC Hendricks. He was representing something larger to everyone on this plane. As they began their descent into Minneapolis, the captain came on the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach. When we land, we ask that you remain seated until Staff Sergeant Wilson and Private Hendricks have deplaned. It's a small gesture of respect we can offer." Marcus gazed out the window as the Minnesota landscape came into view. The hardest part of his mission still lay ahead. The plane touched down in Minneapolis with a gentle bump. As they taxied to the gate, Marcus could see through the window that something unusual was happening. A line of uniformed personnel stood on the tarmac in perfect formation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "we have arrived in Minneapolis. As I mentioned earlier, please remain seated while our fallen hero and his escort deplane first." The plane came to a complete stop. Unlike the usual rush of passengers reaching for overhead bins, everyone sat still. Many watched Marcus with respect in their eyes. The flight attendant approached. "Staff Sergeant Wilson, we're ready when you are." Marcus nodded, stood, and straightened his uniform. As he walked down the aisle toward the door, passengers nodded or placed hands over hearts. A few veterans offered salutes, which Marcus returned crisply. At the aircraft door, the captain was waiting. "Staff Sergeant, it's been an honor having you and Private Hendricks on our flight today." "Thank you for your respect, Captain," Marcus replied. When the door opened, Marcus saw the full extent of what awaited. A full military honor guard stood at attention on the tarmac. Behind them, airport workers, pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew had formed lines. Many held their hands over their hearts. Marcus descended the stairs to the tarmac, standing at attention at the bottom as the ground crew carefully unloaded PFC Hendricks's flag-draped transfer case. The honor guard moved with precision, their white gloves stark against the dark blue of their uniforms. A senior officer approached Marcus. "Staff Sergeant Wilson, I'm Colonel James Mitchell. We're here to assist with the transfer." "Thank you, sir," Marcus said, saluting. From the terminal windows, hundreds of travelers watched the solemn ceremony unfolding on the tarmac. Many had their phones out, recording the moment. Airport announcements had temporarily ceased out of respect. The honor guard moved the transfer case with practiced precision into a waiting hearse. Marcus followed, maintaining his position at the side of his fallen comrade. As they prepared to leave the tarmac, a black SUV pulled up. A man in a suit stepped out and approached Colonel Mitchell, speaking urgently. The colonel then walked over to Marcus. "Staff Sergeant, there's been a development. Word of what happened at the departure gate has spread. The airline CEO is here and would like a word before you depart." Marcus hesitated. "Sir, my priority is getting PFC Hendricks to his family without delay." "I understand completely," the colonel replied. "The CEO has requested just 2 minutes of your time. It's your call." Marcus glanced at his watch. They were still on schedule. 2 minutes, sir. No more." A tall woman in a business suit approached, her face serious. "Staff Sergeant Wilson, I'm Victoria Reynolds, CEO of the airline. I wanted to meet you personally to apologize for what happened today. It was unacceptable and does not reflect our values or our deep respect for service members." Marcus stood at parade rest. "Thank you, ma'am. We've already begun a full review of our protocols for military escorts," she continued. "And I want you to know that Richard Keller has been terminated, effective immediately." Marcus nodded but stayed focused on his mission. "Ma'am, I appreciate you coming here, but right now, my duty is to PFC Hendricks and his family." "Of course," she replied. "One more thing. We've arranged police escort for your journey to the funeral home, and we'd like to cover all expenses for the Hendricks family if they need to travel in the future. That's very generous. I'll make sure they know, Marcus said. The CDO stepped back. Godspeed, Staff Sergeant. Marcus climbed into the hearse beside the driver. As they pulled away from the terminal, he noticed something remarkable. All along the airport access road, people had stopped their cars and were standing outside them, many with hands over hearts. Word had spread throughout the airport community. Inside the terminal, passengers from Marcus's flight were sharing what they had witnessed. Videos from the confrontation at the departure gate were already going viral on social media. Hashtag Respect the Fallen was trending, alongside hashtag Staff Sergeant Wilson. But Marcus wasn't thinking about any of that. His thoughts were on the coming meeting with the Hendricks family and the solemn duty he still needed to complete. The police escort led the hearse through the streets of Minneapolis with silent efficiency. Afternoon traffic parted as the procession of vehicles moved through the city. Marcus sat in solemn silence, mentally preparing for what would be the most difficult part of his mission. The funeral home was a stately brick building with white columns. As the hearse pulled into the driveway, Marcus could see a small group of people waiting near the entrance. His heart grew heavy knowing these were the people whose lives had changed forever when PFC Hendricks didn't come home alive. That's the family, the driver said quietly, the parents and the sister. They've been here for an hour already, waiting. Marcus nodded. Thank you for getting us here safely. The hearse came to a stop. Marcus stepped out and straightened his uniform once more. Colonel Mitchell, who had followed in another vehicle, approached. Staff Sergeant, the family has been briefed on the ceremony. Are you ready? Yes, sir, Marcus replied, though ready wasn't exactly how he felt. No one was ever truly ready for this duty. The honor guard assembled around the hearse. With practiced precision, they removed PFC Hendricks's transfer case and positioned themselves to carry it inside. Marcus walked ahead to meet the family first, as protocol dictated. Mr. and Mrs. Hendricks stood close together, supporting each other. Beside them was a young woman who looked so much like the photo of PFC Hendricks that she could only be his sister. Their faces showed the kind of grief that words could never adequately describe. Marcus approached and stood at attention before them. Mr. and Mrs. Hendricks, Miss Hendricks, I am Staff Sergeant Marcus Wilson. I have been entrusted with escorting your son and brother, Private First Class James Hendricks, home to you. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, I extend our deepest condolences on your loss. Mrs. Hendricks stepped forward first, tears streaming down her face. Instead of speaking, she simply embraced Marcus. It wasn't part of the protocol, but Marcus understood the need for human connection in this moment of grief. Thank you for bringing our boy home, Mr. Hendricks said, his voice breaking. He was trying to stay strong, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. It has been my highest honor, sir, Marcus replied. PFC Hendricks's sister looked at Marcus with red-rimmed eyes. Was someone with him? At the end? The question caught Marcus off guard. He hadn't expected to discuss the circumstances of death, but he saw the desperate need for information in her eyes. According to the report I received, he was with his squad. His staff sergeant was holding his hand. He wasn't alone, Marcus told her gently. She nodded, a small sob escaping her lips. The honor guard approached with the transfer case. The family turned to watch as PFC Hendricks made his final journey. The funeral director led them into a private room where the formal transfer would take place. Inside, Marcus supervised as the honor guard positioned the transfer case exactly as regulations specified. Then, with deliberate movements, he approached Mr. Hendricks. Sir, I am now officially transferring your son into your care, Marcus said, offering the formal documents that completed his mission. Mr. Hendricks accepted the papers with trembling hands. My son always said the army was like another family to him. Looks like he was right. He was our brother, Marcus confirmed. And we don't forget our own. As the formal portion of the ceremony concluded, Mrs. Hendricks approached Marcus again. We heard about what happened at the airport. Someone showed us a video. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, that's not important now. It is to us, she insisted. The way you stood up for our son, the way you made sure he was treated with respect. It matters to us. How you handled yourself, Mr. Hendricks added, with such dignity despite that disrespect. It showed us exactly why Jimmy was so proud to serve. Marcus felt a lump in his throat. Your son deserved nothing less, sir. The sister stepped forward. Will you stay for the service tomorrow? It would mean a lot to have you there. Marcus hadn't planned to stay, but looking into their eyes, he couldn't refuse. It would be my honor. As the family turned their attention to the funeral director to discuss final arrangements, Marcus stepped back, his official duty complete but his personal commitment to PFC Hendricks and his family not yet over. The morning of PFC James Hendricks's funeral dawned clear and bright. Marcus woke early in his hotel room, the same routine of military precision guiding his movements as he prepared his uniform. Though his official escort duty had ended yesterday, he felt a personal obligation to see this through to the end. News vans lined the street outside the church. The story of what happened at the airport had spread across the country overnight. Marcus avoided the reporters, slipping in through a side entrance where a funeral home staff member was waiting for him. The family asked that you sit with them, the woman explained, leading Marcus to the front row where the Hendricks family had saved him a seat. Mrs. Hendricks took his hand when he approached. Thank you for coming, Sergeant Wilson. The church filled quickly. Local veterans in their service caps, neighbors and friends, classmates from PFC Hendricks's high school, but there were also dozens of uniformed service members who had come from bases across the region after hearing the story. More surprising were the airline employees, pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew in their uniforms, who had come on their own time to pay respects. Diane, the regional manager who had helped at the gate, nodded respectfully to Marcus from her seat. The service was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Friends shared stories of Jimmy's kindness and humor. His sister read a letter he had sent her just 2 weeks before his death, speaking of his hopes to become a teacher when he returned home. When the time came for the military honors outside the church, Marcus stood with the official honor guard, the precision of the flag-folding ceremony, the sharp report of the rifle salute, the haunting notes of taps floating through the air, each element performed with perfect respect. Marcus watched as the commanding officer knelt before Mrs. Hendricks, presenting her with the folded flag. On behalf of a grateful nation, the words that no mother ever wanted to hear. After the ceremony, people approached Marcus to shake his hand. Many mentioned the airport incident, expressing admiration for how he had handled himself. You did more than escort my son home, Mr. Hendricks told Marcus quietly as the crowds began to disperse. You showed the world what real honor looks like. As Marcus prepared to leave, his phone rang. It was his commanding officer. Wilson, you've become quite famous, the officer said. The video has millions of views. The Secretary of the Army called me personally about you. Sir, I was just doing my duty, Marcus replied. That's exactly what I told him, his commander said. Now listen, the Secretary wants you to help revise our escort training protocols. Your handling of the situation is being called exemplary. Report back to base tomorrow for new orders. 3 days later, Marcus found himself in a conference room at the Pentagon, describing the incident and suggesting improvements to the military escort protocols. Airline executives, including CEO Victoria Reynolds, were present. Because of Staff Sergeant Wilson's professionalism, we've implemented new training for all our staff, Reynolds explained. We're also creating a special service desk at major airports specifically for military escorts and bereaved families. The Secretary of the Army nodded approvingly. Staff Sergeant Wilson demonstrated exactly what we mean by bearing and dignity under pressure. His actions will help ensure all our fallen receive the respect they deserve. 1 month later, Marcus stood before a group of soldiers at Fort Bragg. As the Army's new lead instructor for the Dignified Transfer Program, he was responsible for training the next generation of military escorts. Your duty is sacred, he told the attentive soldiers. You are the final guardian, the last watchful eye ensuring our fallen brothers and sisters come home with honor. In Minneapolis, the Hendricks family had established a scholarship in Jimmy's name for students who wanted to become teachers. The first recipient was a young woman whose father had also served in Afghanistan. And at airports across the country, a new protocol known informally as the Wilson Procedure ensured that no military escort would ever again face questioning or disrespect while performing their solemn duty. Staff Sergeant Marcus Wilson had set out simply to bring a fallen soldier home with dignity. In doing so, he had changed how an entire nation honored its heroes.